I had not slept properly in 11 days. My bunk aboard the transport shuttle smelled like recycled air and cold metal, and the thin blanket they had given me was designed for a Thari body, which runs about 12 degrees warmer than a human. I lay there in the dark listening to the distant hum of the docking clamps, and when the alert tone cut through the silence, I was on my feet. Before the second pulse, the message was short. It said the Concord emergency session had been called for 6,000. It said attendance was mandatory for all remaining delegates. It said the Voth ascendancy had taken the Catholics border stations overnight. I read it 3 times, then I put on my uniform, laced my boots, and walked to the observation deck to watch the stars for a while before the world changed. Station Vareth 9 was the largest structure humanity had ever been permitted to dock at. It hung in neutral space like a cathedral carved from asteroid rock, its outer rings lit by the pale blue glow of Thari lanterns that burned continuously as a symbol of eternal diplomacy. Inside it could hold 300 delegates from 84 recognized species. The central chamber alone was large enough to swallow 4 city blocks, its ceiling lost somewhere in the dark above, its floor a mosaic of tiles representing every member civilization of the galactic Concord. When I walked in at 5:58, there were 9 of us left, 9 delegates rattling around in a room built for 300. The emptiness did something to the air. It made every footstep too loud. It made the holographic displays in the center of the chamber seem almost cruel in their brightness, showing the live tactical map of the outer rim, showing the red markers of Voth fleet positions, advancing like a tide that had not decided to stop yet. I took my seat in the human section, which was a single chair at a small desk in the far left quadrant of the floor. For 2 years I had been the only human delegate here, and for 2 years that had been a minor embarrassment, a reminder that human was the newest member of the Concord and the least regarded. Now looking at the 8 other occupied seats scattered across that enormous floor, I thought that maybe being small and easy to overlook had its advantages. Ambassador Kale Voss of the Thari arrived last. He was tall, even by Thari standards, with the long silver neck and the 4-fingered hands that their species was known for. And he moved slowly, the way very old beings move when they have stopped pretending that urgency changes outcomes. He sat at the central podium and looked at the 9 of us for a long moment without speaking. Then he said, in the translated standard that the Concord used for all formal sessions, that the situation was beyond recovery. He did not say it dramatically. He said it the way a doctor says something to a patient who already knows, flat, careful, honest. The Voth ascendancy had taken 12 colonies in 6 weeks. They had not destroyed them, which would have been easier to understand. They had absorbed them, converting every structure, every resource, every living thing they found into material for their next advance. The Concord had deployed its combined defense fleet twice. The first deployment had been rooted in under 4 hours. The second had not returned at all. No weapon in the collective arsenal of 84 civilizations had done more than slow the advance temporarily. No negotiation had found a point of compromise because the Voth did not negotiate from a position of wanting things. They expanded because expansion was what They were asking them to stop was like asking a river to stop flowing downhill. Kale Voss had been the most respected diplomat in the Concord for 40 years. He had solved 3 interstellar conflicts, ended 2 resource wars, and once talked a species back from the edge of self-extinction through nothing but patience and careful words. He sat at that podium and told us in simple and precise language that he did not know what to do. The Orvani delegate, a small being named Shuret, who communicated through a translation caller, asked about the evacuation status of the core worlds. Kale Voss said the civilian transports were loading now. He said they had perhaps 3 weeks before the Voth reached the inner systems. He said the Concord's formal recommendation was that member species begin dispersal protocol, scatter into deep space, preserve populations and genetic records, and hope that the Voth advance would slow or change direction on its own. He paused after saying that. I think even he understood how it sounded. One by one, the 8 other delegates stood, gathered their things, and left. Some of them spoke quietly to each other. Some of them said nothing at all. The Orvani delegate looked at me on his way out, and I could not read his expression because I had never learned Orvani facial language well enough to try, but he looked at me for a moment longer. That felt accidental, and then he was gone. Kale Voss remained at the podium. I remained in my chair. We sat in that enormous quiet room together, and after a while he said, without looking at me, that I should go, that the human transport was cleared to depart within the hour, that there was nothing left to do here. I told him I was not leaving. He turned and looked at me then. He had been alive for 312 years, which is middle-aged for a Thari, and in those eyes was the particular tiredness of someone who has watched a great many things fail. He said gently that he understood the impulse. He said that humans were a brave species, that the Concord had always admired that about us, even when we were difficult and unpredictable and occasionally alarming to the older civilizations. He said that bravery without a plan was only a different kind of surrender. I told him I had a plan. He asked what it was. I told him I was going to call Earth. He was quiet for a moment, then he said that Earth had no fleet capable of standing against the Voth, that humanity had been a spacefaring civilization for less than 200 years, that our military technology, while creative, was generations behind the combined resources that had already failed. I said, yes, I know all of that. He asked what I thought Earth could offer that 84 other civilizations could not. I thought about how to answer that. I thought about what I knew of human history, which I had studied because I was a diplomat, and diplomats study their own species the way other people study foreign ones, trying to understand what we look like from the outside. I thought about the long catalog of times we had been outmatched, outgunned, outresourced, and outpositioned, and what we had done in those moments. We had not always won. That was the honest answer. We had lost plenty of times. We had been beaten back and driven out and forced to retreat and made to sign terms we hated. But there was a particular thing that happened when humanity was pushed all the way to the edge of something, when there was nowhere left to go and nothing left to lose, and the only two options were give up or keep going. We got strange, we got creative, we got stubborn in ways that made no rational sense and yet somehow kept producing results that rational sense said were impossible. I thought about a narrow mountain pass and 300 soldiers who held it for 3 days, knowing they would not survive. I thought about a beach in France and small civilian boats crossing open water to bring soldiers home, not because anyone ordered them to, but because they simply decided they were going to. I thought about a frozen reservoir on the other side of the planet from where I grew up, and the soldiers who walked out of it in temperatures that should have been a death sentence walking out, because they refused to accept that the cold had a vote in the matter. Those were not stories about winning, they were stories about what happens when you take away every reason to keep going, except one, and that one reason in every version of every story was the same: the people behind us, the ones who come next. I looked at Kale Voss and I said, humanity is not the strongest species in this galaxy. We are not the oldest or the wisest or the most advanced, but we are possibly the most difficult to convince that something is truly over. And I think the Voss have never encountered that before. He looked at me for a long time, 312 years of patience and experience, looking at a human woman in her early 40s, sitting in a too big chair in an empty room, telling him she was going to call her planet and ask it to stand in the path of something that had already destroyed everything else. He said he hoped I was right. I said so did I. Then I picked up my communications device and sent one message to Earth. Command. It was 11 words long. It said, "We are staying. The conquered has withdrawn. Send everything you have." I put the device down and looked at the tactical display, at the red markers, still moving slowly inward like a tide. And I drank the rest of my cold coffee. And I started to plan. Behind me I heard Kale Voss settle back into his chair. He did not leave. I had not expected him to, really. 312 years old, and he was still here. Maybe that was what wisdom actually looked like when it stopped trying to be practical and started being something else entirely. I pulled up the Voss fleet data and began to read. UES Relentless was not a beautiful ship. I want to be honest about that from the start, because the versions of this story that get told later tend to make everything sound more impressive than it was. The Relentless was a modified carrier originally built as a heavy transport for mining operations in the outer belt, retrofitted twice in 18 months to carry weapon systems that did not quite fit, and crew quarters that were too small, and an engine configuration that one of our engineers described with a certain cheerful resignation as held together by institutional optimism. I loved that ship from the moment I walked up the boarding ramp. It was 18 days after the empty chamber on Varith 9. Earth had responded to my 11 words with a speed that I think surprised even me. Within 72 hours of my message, the first ships were already moving. Within a week, 34 vessels were en route to rendezvous at coordinates I had chosen, specifically because they were difficult to approach without crossing 3 sensor shadows, which bought us time and kept us invisible to Voth. Long-range detection. The Relentless was the flagship by default. She was the largest ship we had, which is not the same as saying she was large. She could hold a crew of 420, carry 6 squadrons of short-range interceptors, and fire a continuous broadside long enough to matter in the kind of engagement I was starting to build in my head. Her captain was a man named Owen Price from the coast of Wales, who had the easy calm of someone who had decided long ago that worrying about things he could not control was a waste of perfectly good attention. I liked him immediately and trusted him within the first hour, which is not something I say easily. The alien volunteers arrived over the following days. There were not many of them. Of the 84 species in the Concord, 11 had sent representatives to fight alongside us. Most sent single ships or small groups. The Thari sent 2 heavy cruisers and a contingent of ground troops. It was a fraction of what they could have offered, but it was more than anyone else had managed, and I understood the political cost of it. One of those Thari was Lieutenant Prescott. He came aboard the Relentless 3 days into our gathering, assigned as a liaison between the Thari cruisers and our command structure, and I met him in the corridor outside the briefing room on his first morning. He was younger than I expected, maybe 80 years old, which for a Thari is roughly equivalent to a human in their mid-20s. He was tall, silver-necked, precise in his movements, and looking at the ship around him with an expression I had learned to recognize in the weeks since the Concord session, the expression of someone who has committed to a thing and is now actively working through the implications of that commitment. I showed him to his quarters, which were too small and which I apologized for. He said that the size was fine. He said he had not come for comfort. I said, good, because we are not going to have much of that. The first full command session happened that evening in the Relentless briefing room. 31 officers from 12 species crowded around a table that was really only designed for 20, looking at a holographic map of the Kalis expanse and the positions of 90 Voth dreadnoughts moving toward the core systems at a pace that assumed no one was going to meaningfully resist them. Our side had 34 ships. I watched the faces in that room as I laid out the numbers. The human officers showed the same expression they always showed in situations like this, a kind of focused, flinty attention, the look of people doing rapid mental arithmetic and deciding that the math, while not ideal, was workable. The alien officers showed something closer to grief, not because they were weaker of spirit, but because they had been trained by their cultures to assess a situation honestly and respond to a losing position by withdrawing and preserving resources for a later opportunity. The problem was that there was no later opportunity. There was only this. I told them that. I said, I know the numbers look wrong. They are wrong by any conventional standard of fleet engagement. I am not going to pretend otherwise, because you deserve honesty, and also because you would see through it immediately. What I am going to tell you is that the numbers are not the only thing that matters in this fight. I pulled up a different display, not fleet positions or weapons data history, specifically a series of engagements from human history in which the side that appeared on paper to have no chance of winning had made a significant impact. Anyway, I talked about a mountain pass. I talked about a sea battle off the coast of a small island where 17 warships held off a fleet of over 130 for long enough to matter. I talked about a winter campaign in a frozen forest where soldiers who had run out of almost everything continued to disrupt supply lines and tie up resources for weeks, not because they expected to win the engagement, but because they understood that every hour they kept the enemy occupied was an hour that other people used to prepare. Preth Carr was listening very carefully. At the end, he asked a question that I could tell he had been holding since I started speaking. He asked, in how many of those examples did the smaller force actually survive? I was quiet for a moment, then I said, not all of them. Some of them died to the last person. But the thing they were protecting survived. And in the calculation they were making, that was the part that mattered. The room was very quiet. One of the human officers, a lieutenant named Gary Holt from the carrier wing, leaned forward and said, "Commander is right. My grandfather used to say there are two kinds of courage, the kind where you fight because you think you can win, and the kind where you fight because you cannot live with the alternative. He said the second kind is harder to stop." I looked around the room. I looked at the Thari officers and the Orvani pilot in the corner and the two civil engineers who had volunteered their ship because their species believed that a debt of protection, once incurred, could not be discharged by looking away. I said, "We are not here to die for a principle, we are here to fight for a result, and the result I want is that in 6 weeks the Voth advance is no longer advancing." I said, "To do that we are going to fight differently than anything things have seen before. We are going to feint, we are going to retreat and lure, we are going to sacrifice position to create opportunity. We are going to treat every engagement not as a battle to win cleanly, but as a problem to solve with whatever we have available." I said, "Some of that is going to look strange to those of you from other traditions. Some of it is going to look wasteful or reckless. When it does, I want you to trust that there is a reason and ask me about it." Afterward, the Thari commander of the first cruiser, a woman named Saravas, who was Kelvas's younger sister and had the same quiet steadiness as her brother, raised her hand. She said, "You said you would sacrifice ships." I said, "Yes," she said, "our tradition holds that a ship represents not only its crew but the investment of future generations. To spend a ship is to spend the future." I said, "I understand that, and I respect it completely. What I would ask you to consider is this: if the Voth reach the core worlds, there is no future in which those ships would have mattered anyway. A ship we spend today to slow them down, to buy us a day or a week or a position, is a ship that earns its cost, a ship preserved perfectly until the end changes nothing." Saravas considered that for a long time. Then she said, "I do not like it, but I think you are correct." I said, "Good, I do not need you to like it, I need you to trust me." 3 days later we executed the first operation. The plan was called a layered feint, which is a human military term for a maneuver that requires you to offer the enemy something that looks like an opportunity and then make them regret taking it. We sent one wing of 8 ships, 6 human destroyers and 2 Tharian scouts straight toward the leading edge of the Voth advance fast. No subtlety, the kind of move that looks desperate. The Voth responded exactly as their behavioral patterns predicted. They pulled 3 dreadnoughts from the main formation to chase because their doctrine said that an enemy moving that fast and that directly was either fleeing or launching a suicide strike. And either way it needed to be intercepted. What they did not know was that the corridor they were entering had been seated over the previous 48 hours, with a chain of improvised mass driver, projectiles camouflaged against the debris field of a collapsed relay, station positioned at the precise intervals our weapons our X-team had calculated for maximum overlap. The 8 ships pulled back the moment the dreadnoughts committed to the chase. They curved wide and hard, giving the projectile field a clear lane. The results were not perfect. We had hoped for more damage than we achieved, and one of our destroyers took a hit on the retreat that cost us our port engine array and the lives of 6 crew members. I noted their names in my personal log that night because I had decided on the first day I would do that for every person we lost, and I intended to keep that decision even when it was difficult. But 2 of the 3 dreadnoughts were heavily damaged. 1 was disabled completely. The Voth advance slowed by 11 hours while they reorganized. 11 hours. Privka came to my cabin that evening and stood in the doorway, looking at me the way people look at something they are trying to make sense of. He said, "You lost 6 people and a ship's engine array to delay the enemy by 11 hours. I said, "Yes," he said. "How do you decide that is worth it?" I said, "By calculating what 11 hours costs them in terms of the position they cannot take and the pressure they cannot apply to our reformations." I said, "By the number of people behind us who use those 11 hours to move further from harm." I said, "By the understanding that we are not fighting one battle, we are fighting a sequence of moments, and each moment we steal from them is a moment that compounds." He was quiet for a while, then he said, "You genuinely believe we can do this?" I said, "Yes." He asked why. I thought about it honestly, because he deserved an honest answer and not a speech. I told him that I thought the Voth had expanded for so long against opponents who, however capable, eventually reached a point where the logical choice was to stop, retreat, disperse, wait, adapt. Every civilization they had ever faced had that choice available and had eventually taken it. It was the rational choice. It was the wise choice very often, but humanity had a long, sometimes uncomfortable history of cases where the rational choice was not the one we made. And I believed, though I could not prove it, that we were about to demonstrate something that the Voth had never had to model for an opponent who kept coming, not because they did not understand the cost, but because they had looked at the cost and decided it was still less than the alternative. Prithskal looked at me for a long moment, then he said, "I want to understand how you train for this. I want to attend every briefing from this point forward." I said, "You are welcome to all of them." He came to every single one. He sat in the back and said nothing and watched, and I noticed that he stopped looking disturbed after the second week and started looking like someone who was beginning to see a pattern they had not expected to find. Outside, the Voth kept moving, and we kept making them regret every mile. The 33rd day was the day I stopped sleeping in my bunk and started sleeping in the command chair, not because I chose to exactly, more because every time I went back to my quarters, something happened within an hour that needed my immediate attention. And after the 4th time of jogging down the corridor, half awake to deal with a situation that had already developed without me, I decided the most efficient thing was to simply not leave. Owen Price brought me a pillow. Gary Holt brought me coffee. Neither of them said anything About it, which is one of the things I appreciated most about my crew. We were 6 weeks into the campaign now. 31 ships had become 22. We had fought 19 separate engagements, most of them the luring and retreating style I had described in that first briefing, some of them things that had gone wrong in ways that required immediate improvisation rather than any plan I had made in advance. We had taken heavy losses. Every name in my log felt heavier than the one before it. The Voth fleet had gone from 90 dreadnoughts to 61. I want you to understand what that means because the number sounds abstract until you think about the math. 61 dreadnoughts was still nearly 3 times our remaining strength. We had not broken their fleet. We had not won anything decisive, but we had slowed an advance that had been moving at a pace that should have already seen them in the core systems, and we had done it with a force that every conventional analysis said should have been overwhelmed in the first week. They kept expecting us to stop. That was the key. I understood it more clearly as the weeks went on. The Voth had a model for how opponents behaved, and in that model every opponent had a threshold, a point of losses or time or attrition, where the calculation flipped and the surviving ships broke off and ran. They had fought 300 civilizations over the course of their expansion, and every single one of those civilizations had eventually crossed that threshold. They kept waiting for us to cross it. We kept not crossing it. I could tell this was disrupting something in their decision-making, because their tactical responses started showing a hesitancy that had not been there in the first 2 weeks. They were recalculating. They were trying to find the new threshold, the updated model for this particular enemy, and every time they thought they had found it, we did something else. Prithkar was in the briefing room one morning when I was running through the next series of planned operations with Gary and the senior weapons officer, a quiet and methodical woman named Caroline Webb, who had an extraordinary ability to calculate firing solutions in her head faster than most people could do it on a console. Prithkar had been attending every briefing for over a month now. He rarely spoke, he observed. That morning he spoke. He said, "Commander, may I ask about the tactical philosophy you are using for the withdrawal bait on the next operation?" I said, "Of course." He said, "You have 3 options for the bait formation. Option 1 offers more firepower, but it's slower to reverse course. Option 2 is faster, but has a weaker visual signature, meaning the Voth may not read it as worth chasing. Option 3 is the compromise, but you have not chosen Option 3. I said, "No," he said. "You have chosen Option 1. I said, "Yes." He said, "Why choose the formation that takes the greater risk of not completing the reversal in time if the Voth respond faster than anticipated?" I said, "Because Option 1 looks scared, the way it moves, the way it groups the slight, ragged formation. It reads as panic to anyone watching. The Voth have been studying our movements for 6 weeks, and the one thing they have not seen us do convincingly is panic. If I show them something that looks genuinely panicked, they will chase harder and deeper than they would for something that looks calculated. And deeper is where I them." Prithkar was quiet for a moment, then he said, "You are performing a psychological state. You do not feel in order to manipulate their strategic response." I said, "Yes." He said Thari doctrine does not include this approach. We consider it a form of dishonesty. I said I understand that. And in a different situation I might agree with you, but the Voth are not reading us the way a diplomatic counterpart reads us. They are reading us the way a predator reads prey. They are looking for the signals that tell them whether to push or ease off. And I am going to give them the signal that makes them push into the place where we want them. Prethkar was quiet for a long time after that. Caroline said it worked at Kala Station and at the relay junction on day 24. Prethkar nodded slowly. He said, yes, I watched both of those. I simply did not understand the mechanism until now. I said, the Thari have fought with honesty and directness for thousands of years, and it has served your civilization extraordinarily well. I respect that deeply, but the Voth are not a civilization we can negotiate with or outmaneuver through superior strategy alone. They are a force that believes it understands the nature of conflict completely, and the only thing that will genuinely disrupt that belief is encountering something they have never had to account for. He said, which is what? I said, an opponent that keeps choosing to fight in ways that make no sense by the rules the Voth believe govern conflict. We have been rewriting those rules for 6 weeks, and every time they think they have the new version, we change them again. Eventually that breaks something, not a ship, not a formation, something internal. The confidence that they know how this ends. Prethkar looked at me for a long moment, then he said, Ambassador Kale, Voth told me before I left Thari space that you were probably the strangest diplomat he had ever encountered. He said that you argued for staying when every piece of evidence pointed toward leaving, and that your reasoning was either brilliant or delusional. And he was genuinely unsure which. He said to watch you carefully and report back whatever I learned. I said, what are you going to report? He said, I believe he was correct that it is brilliant. I was not sure until this conversation. Then he said I would like permission to share some of this approach with the Thali cruiser commanders, not the deceptive elements but the underlying understanding of conflict as a sequence of solvable problems rather than a fixed outcome to accept or resist. I said, please do. I was wounded on day 38. It happened during a close range engagement near the Dora's navigation point when a Voth strike craft broke through our port wing and hit the Relentless twice in rapid succession. The second hit took out the bridge secondary panel and sent shrapnel through the command area. I took a piece of it in my left shoulder and another across my right side. Neither of them critical, both of them requiring immediate attention from our medic, a young man named Oliver Grant, who had the particular calm of someone who had decided very early in his career that panicking was simply not a useful clinical tool. I remember the ship lurching. I remember Owen Price shouting coordinates. I remember the strange clarity that comes with pain, how everything gets very simple and very focused, and how in that moment the only thought I had was, check the tactical display. The tactical display was intact. We were winning the exchange. I sat in the command chair while Oliver worked on my shoulder, and I kept giving orders, and at one point he said, Commander, you need to hold still or this is going to be harder than it needs to be. And I said, noted, and kept giving orders, and he sighed in the way that medics sigh when they have made their professional recommendation and the patient has chosen to ignore it. The alien crew members on the bridge were watching me. I noticed this later when things had calmed down and the engagement was over, and we were assessing our status. Several of the Thari Bridge crew and the two civil officers who had come aboard 3 weeks earlier after their own ship was disabled were looking at me in a way could not immediately read, not shock. Exactly, not fear. Something more like recalibration. Sarah Voss, who had transferred to the Relentless temporarily while her own cruisers underwent repairs, came to me. That evening, she sat across from me in the small common area off the bridge, and she said, "I wanted to ask something personal." I said, "Of course," she said, "when you were wounded today and you continued working, it was not because you did not feel it. I could see that you did." I said, "Yes," she said, "so why continue?" For us, when an individual is injured, the immediate priority is that individual's health and recovery. The role passes to the next officer. This is not weakness, it is wisdom. I said, "I know, and your way is not wrong, but in that moment what I felt was less important than what the people around me needed to see. If I had stopped, what they would have seen is that we had been hurt enough to stop, and I did not want that to be the story of that moment." She said, "You were performing again like the panic formation." I said, "In a way, yes, but also not entirely." I genuinely did not want to stop. There is a thing that happens sometimes when the situation is very bad and you are in physical pain and everything is loud and overwhelming. If you can keep going in those conditions, something happens to your people. They look at you and they think, if she can keep going, I can keep going. It is not a tactic. Exactly, it is just a thing that works. Sarah Voss was quiet. Then she said, "My brother told me you would be different from other humans he had met." I said, "Kale Voss is a very generous man," she said. "He said you were the kind of person who understood that every action in a moment of crisis is also a message to the people around you." He said that humans, at their best, are extraordinarily good at sending the right message. I said, "We have had a lot of practice being in crisis." She said, "Yes, I think that is exactly it." 10 days later, Earth sent a general civilian broadcast. I had not requested it and had not known it was coming. It went out on every frequency that reached our position, and we picked it up in the early morning hours, and Owen Price woke me from a short sleep in the command chair to listen. It was voices, thousands of them, from schools and hospitals and neighborhoods on every continent. Children reading letters they had written, adults speaking directly to the crew of the fleet by name where they knew the names, and to the aliens fighting alongside them and saying simply, "We know you are out there. We are watching. We are grateful." There were paintings, drawings from children, transmitted as image files alongside the audio, covering the screens on every ship that received the broadcast. The Relentless's main display, which we usually used for tactical data, was suddenly full of crayon drawings of starships and alien silhouettes and the words "Thank you" in 17 languages. I was not prepared for that. I do not think I am ashamed to say that I sat in my command chair at Aero 400 station time and needed a moment. Just a moment around me. The bridge crew went very quiet. Prithka was on the bridge that morning, going over some Data at a secondary console. I heard him. Stop moving. I looked over and he was staring at the display, at the children's drawings and the letters, and his expression was something I had not seen on him before. He looked like he had understood something. Later, he told me that he had sent a recording of that broadcast to Kale Voss and to the Thari High Council. He said that he had included a note saying this is why they do not stop. They do not fight for an abstract principle or a strategic position. They fight for this. This is what they are protecting, he said. The response from the High Council had been immediate. They were sending 3 more ships outside. The red markers on the tactical display were still moving, but they were moving more slowly now, and the recalculation delays were getting longer. We were doing something to them, something that did not show up in any weapons assessment or fleet engagement report. We were doing it simply by refusing to be what they expected day after day, week after week, in ways that no model they possessed had prepared them to understand. I looked at the drawings on the main display and I thought, yes, this is why. Then I asked Owen to restore the tactical data, and I got back to work. The briefing for the Verith line operation lasted 4 hours. I did not give a speech. I want to be absolutely clear about that, because the stories that circulate tend to involve something dramatic, something with memorable lines and carefully chosen words designed to inspire. What actually happened was that I walked into the briefing room with my data pad, pulled up the tactical map and said, here is the situation, here is what I think we can do about it, and here is what I need from each of you. Situation was this: the Voth fleet, now reduced to 63 active dreadnoughts through our 7 weeks of attrition, had adjusted their course and was moving directly toward Verith Station. Behind Verith Station were the core systems. Behind the core systems were approximately 10 billion sentient beings, the largest concentration of remaining conquered population, people who had believed the outer ring defense would hold and had not moved far enough or fast enough when it had not. If the Voth passed Verith, those people had no protection left. We had 22 ships. The math was not good. I did not pretend it was good. I showed them the numbers, the fleet ratios, the weapons assessments, the probability estimates generated by our tactical AI. The AI gave us a 14% chance of successfully blunting the advance. I told them the AI was probably optimistic about the Voth response time on some of our maneuvers, and that the real number was likely slightly better, maybe 20%. No one in the room looked like 20% was good news. Owen Price asked the practical question, what is the objective? Is it to survive, to destroy a certain number of their ships, to buy us time? I said the objective is to make them stop, not to defeat them. In the traditional sense, not to destroy their fleet, but to cost them so much in this engagement and to confuse their models enough that the calculation they are running about the value of continuing to advance stops coming up positive. I said, the Voth have never stopped before. They have never turned back, but they have also never hit an opponent like this in a fight that has looked the way this fight has looked for 7 weeks. They are confused. Their delays keep getting longer. Their responses keep getting less decisive. Something in their certainty is cracking, and I believe that if we hit them hard enough here in ways they Cannot predict, we can crack at the rest of the way, Sarah Voth said, and if we cannot, I said, then we die at the last defensible line instead of somewhere safer, and the 10 billion people behind us have the additional time we can give them to get further away. Either way, we are not wasting this position. She nodded. She had heard me say versions of this for 7 weeks. I think by then she believed it. In the same way my human officers believed it. Which is to say, not because it sounded hopeful, but because the alternative was something none of us could live with. The operation plan had 5 phases. I walked through all of them in detail, without rushing. There were questions, good questions, and I answered all of them honestly, including the ones where the honest answer was, I do not know. We will have to adapt in the moment. Trust your training and your instincts. At the end, Gary Holt asked, what do we do when things go wrong? I said, the same thing we have been doing for 7 weeks. We solve the problem in front of us with whatever we have. We do not wait for the ideal solution, because the ideal solution is not coming. We use what is there. We began the engagement at 8:30 the next morning. I will not try to make what followed sound clean or controlled, because it was neither. Space combat at the scale we were operating never is. The tactical map that I had studied for days turned into something much more chaotic and immediate the moment it became real, and every phase of the plan either happened differently than expected, or had to be modified on the fly, or simply did not happen at all. It was replaced by something we invented in the moment. Phase 1 worked. We split our formation and came at the Voth fleet from 2 angles, forcing them to split their response. The 2 wings drew fire long enough for our central element to close range faster than they expected. Phase 2 partially worked. 2 of our 4 planned missile barrage sequences executed cleanly. The other 2 were disrupted by a Voth flanking move that I had anticipated as a low probability response and had not prepared a clean counter for. Owen Price put us into an evasive spiral that was not in any plan, and worked because Owen Price had been flying ships for 23 years and had an instinctive feel for their limits that was genuinely something to see. The main cannon array on the Relentless took a direct hit during the 3rd hour of the engagement. I heard the impact before I felt it, a deep structural vibration that went through the entire fresh ship, and then the weapons console went dark, and Caroline Webb said in a very level voice that we had lost main battery function on decks 7 through 12 for approximately 2 seconds. The bridge was very quiet. Then one of the Thari engineers, a young officer named Kelmeth, who had transferred to our ship after the Saravox cruiser was reassigned, said, "Commander, I have an idea." It was Pref Carr who told me later exactly where the idea came from. He said that Kelmeth had been watching a repair operation 3 weeks earlier on one of our smaller destroyers, when the crew had bypassed a fried targeting system by routing a fire control signal through the navigation array on a neighboring ship using a direct communications link to coordinate the actual firing trigger. It was by conventional weapons engineering standards, not a real solution. It worked by accident as much as design, and the accuracy was significantly reduced. But Kelmeth had watched that and had thought about it, and had apparently spent the last 3 weeks quietly working out a cleaner version of the same idea. Scaled up, he said. If we network the firing systems of 3 damaged ships through a single targeting relay, we can operate them as a single combined weapon. Accuracy will be limited, power will not. B, I said, how long to set it up? He said, 18 minutes if the communications link holds. I said, do it. The 18 minutes were not pleasant. We took 2 more hits, neither critical, and lost 4 crew members in an explosion on Deck 9 that I added to my log that night with the sick feeling I had been carrying for weeks, the weight of names. Then Kelmeth said, ready, 3 ships networked together, fired as one. The Voth dreadnought at the center of their formation had been the anchor point of their entire tactical structure for 7 weeks. It was the one that issued commands, held position, directed the Voth response at every engagement. We had never been able to get a clean shot at it because it stayed behind the forward screen. The combined barrage hit it amidships. I will not claim it was destroyed. It was not, but it was damaged badly enough to lose propulsion. And it began to drift, and for the first time in the engagement, the Voth response slowed not by seconds, but by minutes. They were not recalculating anymore. They were reorienting. Something in their command structure had broken open, and they were trying to find the shape of it. I watched the tactical display. They stopped advancing. Not permanently, not because they had given up, but they stopped, and the stops were getting longer. And I had been watching the Voth move for 7 weeks, and I knew what their normal pattern looked like, and this was not it. Then I got something I had never expected. Hail from the Voth Supreme Commander. Not to the fleet, not a tactical signal. A direct personal communication, addressed to the commander of the human vessels. I took it on the bridge. Translation was handled by the ship's system, and there was a flatness to the voice. That might have been the technology, or might have been the speaker. But the words were clear enough. He asked, what are you? I let the question sit in the air for a moment. I had not prepared for this, because I had not imagined it was a thing that would happen. The Voth did not communicate with opponents during battle. Every piece of intelligence we had said that they communicated with surrendering parties, and with each other. They did not hail enemies who were still shooting. I thought about what to say. Then I said, we are the species that decided your math was wrong. There was a long pause. He said, no species has held this long against us. No species has fought this way. I said, we know, we did our research. He said, you have sustained losses that should have ended your capacity to resist. You have fought in ways that contradict rational self-preservation. I do not understand what you are. I said, I think that is actually the answer to your question. Another pause. Longer this time. He said, our models indicate that you cannot win this engagement. I said, your models have been wrong for 7 weeks. I'm not sure I would trust them on this either. The channel closed, and then the most astonishing thing happened. The Voth fleet stopped moving forward. Not a tactical pause, not a recalculation. Delay. The entire formation, 63 dreadnoughts, held position, and after 6 minutes the forward elements began to pull back. I stood at the tactical display and watched it, and I did not say anything for a while because I was not entirely certain it was real. Owen Price said very quietly, Commander, they are retreating. I said, yes. He said, that has never happened before. Said no, it has not. Saravox came to stand beside me. She looked at the displays in silence for a long time. Then she said, "You told me you believed you could crack the certainty," I said. "I hoped I could," she said. "You were right," I said. "We were right, all of us," she said. "What happens now?" I said. "Now we watch them go, and we help the people behind us, and we count our losses, and we start rebuilding what we can," she said. "And when they come back," I looked at the display at the retreating formation at the gap they were leaving behind. I said, "Then we will still be here." The hillside on New Cascadia smelled like grass and something that might have been wildflowers if you did not look at them too closely, which I did not, because I was not sure yet whether the ecosystem here had stabilized enough to produce real flowers or whether the terraforming was still playing long games with the soil. I had been sitting here for 2 hours when Prithkar found me. He looked different than he had on the Relentless. He was dressed in thari diplomatic clothing now, formal and quiet in its colors, and he moved with the deliberate ease of someone who had spent the last 3 months in meeting rooms rather than warships. He was thinner, I thought, or maybe it was just the different light. He sat down on the grass beside me. For a while neither of us said anything. Below in the valley, the colony buildings were still new looking, their white structures catching the afternoon light. Children were playing on the open ground between the buildings, a game that involved a lot of running and occasional shouting, and seemed to have rules that were either very complex or entirely made up. He said, "The council confirmed the appointment this morning." I said, "I heard." He said, "Are you going to accept?" The appointment was the Concord's formal designation of Earth as a standing guarantor of collective security, the first time in the history of the Concord that a single species had been given that role. It came with obligations and responsibilities and a significant amount of political complexity that I was not sure humanity was ready for, but had been offered, because the Concord had looked at the last 8 weeks and concluded that humanity was possibly the only species that would do the job the way the job needed to be done. I said, "I do not know yet." He said, "Kale Voss believes you will." I said, "Kale Voss is frequently correct." A pause. He said, "I sent my report to the High Council about what I observed during the campaign." I said, "What did they say?" He said, "They found it difficult to read. I think some of it did not translate well through standard frameworks. The parts about human psychology were particularly challenging for them." He paused. "The part about the children's broadcast was not challenging at all. That they understood immediately." I said, "What did they do with it?" He said, "They have begun a formal study of human history, military history, yes, but also cultural history, art, literature, the things that explain why you are the way you are." He smiled, which on a Thari involves a particular set of expressions around the eyes. "My brother personally requested 12 volumes of Earth history for his private reading." I said, "He is going to find a lot of it very troubling." He said, "He is already finding it very troubling. He says he cannot stop reading it." I laughed. Prithkar looked at me when I laughed. He said, "I have been trying to understand something, and I hope you will not mind a personal question." I said, "Go ahead." He said, "When we first met on the Relentless, I thought I understood what motivated you. duty strategy, the protection of your species, but as I watched you over those 8 weeks, I began to think it was something different, something more specific. I said, "What did you think it was?" He pointed toward the valley, toward the children running in the afternoon light. He said that all of this, not in the abstract sense of protecting a civilization or preserving a way of life, but in the very specific sense of wanting the people who come after you to have something to run toward, something worth the running. I looked at the children for a while. I said, "Yes, that is it, that is the whole thing." "Actually," he said, "it seems very simple when you describe it that way." I said, "It is simple. It took us a very long time and a very great deal of suffering to get down to the simple version, but once you have it, it is very simple. Every decision we make has a question underneath it. Does this make things better or worse for the ones who come after? That is the question. Everything else is just working through the answer." Prithkar was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "The Thari have 10,000 years of recorded history, strategic doctrine, diplomatic philosophy, accumulated knowledge. We believe that the answer to most problems could be found somewhere in that accumulated knowledge. That wisdom was primarily a function of memory and experience." He said, "I want to tell you that watching you and your crew for 8 weeks has changed how I understand wisdom. I think now that it is not primarily a function of what you remember, it is a function of what you refuse to accept." I said, "What do you mean?" He said, "You refuse to accept that the Voth were unstoppable, even when they evidence said otherwise. You refuse to accept that the cost was too high, even when the math said otherwise. You refuse to accept that the loss of a ship or a person or a position was the end of the story, even when there was every rational reason to call it the end." He said, "That refusal is not ignorance. It is not blind optimism. You understood the facts perfectly well. You simply refuse to let the facts be the last word." I said, "Yes." He said, "I do not think we have a word for that in Thari. We have many words for wisdom and patience and strategy, but not for that specific thing." I said, "In English we have several, and most of them have complicated histories, stubbornness, tenacity, hope. They are not always flattering because they can also describe the refusal to accept something you should accept. The trick is knowing the difference." He asked, "How do you know the difference?" I thought about that question seriously, because he was asking it seriously. I said, "I think the difference is whether you are refusing for your own sake or for everyone else's sake. Stubbornness for yourself is just another form of fear. Stubbornness for the people who come after you is something else. It is love, I think, with nowhere to go except forward." Prithkar looked at the valley for a long time. Then he said, I'm going to teach this when I return to Thari space. I'm going to try to teach what I learned here, not as military doctrine, but as something broader. I am not certain the language for it exists. Yet I may have to build it." I said, "If you do, I would be glad to see it." He said, "Kale Voss wants you to attend the Concord reopening ceremony 3 weeks from now at Varith Station. The repairs are almost complete. He says the hall should hold 300 delegates again." I said, "Is it going to hold 300? He said, "No. Many species are still relocating. Recovery will take years." But Kale Voss Says the important thing is to open the doors. I said, he is right, that is the important thing. He said he has also quietly ensured that the human section of the chamber has more than one chair. I said, how many? He smiled. Again, he said, he ordered 12 chairs installed. I think it was a gesture of confidence in your species, I said, or a warning that we tend to bring more people than expected. He said, but I believe it was both. I stood up from the hillside below. One of the children in the valley had stumbled and fallen, and another had immediately run over, and then they were both back up and running again, and the whole thing had taken about 4 seconds. I said, when does the ceremony start? He said, 3 weeks. I said, then I have 3 weeks to give an answer about the appointment. He said, do you know what the answer will be? I looked at the valley, at the buildings that were still new, at the grass that was learning to be grass, at the sky above it all, vast and quiet, and full of everything that remained to be done. I said, yes, I think I have known since I was sitting alone in that empty chamber, drinking cold coffee and watching the tactical display. I just needed the right hillside to say it out loud. He waited. I said, tell Kale Voss, yes, tell him we accept, tell him we will be there. Prethkar nodded. He stood and straightened his diplomatic jacket and looked at me the way he had looked at me on the bridge of the Relentless after the children's broadcast, like someone who had understood something important and was still in the process of deciding where to put it. He said, one more question. A personal one. I said, of course. He said, are you afraid of what comes next? I thought about it honestly, because that was what he deserved. I said, a little. Yes, there are a lot of ways for this to go wrong, and the responsibility is very large, and I am one person and one species, and there are limits to both. He said, but I said, but the alternative is to let someone else carry it alone, or let it not be carried at all, and I have never been able to talk myself into accepting that. He said, I know. I said, I know you know. You have been watching me for 2 months. He said, yes, and I have learned more in those 2 months than in the previous 8 decades. He paused. Thank you, Commander. I said, thank the crew. Thank the ones who are not here to hear it. Thank the ones who came back and the ones who did not. I just stayed in the room. He said, that is not a small thing. I said, no, I know it never is. We walked down the hillside together, toward the colony, toward the buildings that were still learning to be home. Children had moved their game closer to the edge of the field, and one of them ran across our path without looking, then looked back with enormous wide eyes, and said sorry in a voice that was mostly laughing, and then ran away again. Prithkar watched the child go and said nothing for a moment. Then he said, I think I understand your species now. Not completely, but enough. I said, honestly, we have been trying to understand ourselves for a very long time. Let me know if you figure out anything we missed. He laughed. For a thari, it is a very particular sound, bright and short like a single struck note. I had heard it before, but not often. Later that evening, in the small room they had given me in the colony administration building, I opened my personal log. I had been writing in it since the first day aboard the Relentless, a record of every decision and every name and every moment that seemed important enough to save. The log was long now, too long to read comfortably in one sitting. I added one last entry. I wrote, New Cascadia. Afternoon, the war is over, or the first Part of it is, which is the part that had to be survived before anything else could happen. Pertha leaves tomorrow. Kale Voss has sent word the children here are playing in a valley that will be green in another 2 years if the soil keeps cooperating. I wrote, I do not know what comes next. I know it will be difficult because things worth doing usually are. I know we will make mistakes because we always do, and the task afterward will be learning from them with honesty and without excuses. I wrote, but we are still here, and tomorrow we will still be here, and that for now is enough. I closed the log and looked out the window at the colony settling into evening, the lights coming on one by one in the white buildings, the sky going from pale blue to the deep color that follows, the particular quiet of a place that is new and still becoming itself. I thought about the empty chamber, the cold coffee, the 11 words I sent to Earth, and the world that answered with everything it had. I thought about every name in the log. I thought, not on my watch. That is all. That is the whole thing. Then I turned off the light and went to sleep.